Alright, hello there. Chapter 17, Reflections and Visual Sources. Let's talk about history and horse races. So historians are fascinated by historic firsts. The most, first achievements in history were non-intentional, and the Industrial Revolution was certainly an unexpected outcome of converging circumstances. And so that focus on firsts can be misleading. And Europeans used their development of industrialization to claim an innate superiority. It's important to emphasize the unexpectedness of the Industrial Revolution, and spread the industrialization around the world diminishes the importance of the why Europe question. And so industrialization will increasingly be seen as a global process. And, historians and students of history often obsess about the first achievements as they represent breakthroughs in human development. And so you really need to think as being first as being better. This can lead to assumption that being first implies that someone is somehow better or something is somehow better. And so world historians stress the unexpected nature of British and European industrialization and note that it was not preordained by an alleged European superiority. So in the future, historians might not be concerned with who was first to industrialize, but how this form of production spread around the world, similar to the spread of, for example, agriculture. Okay, so here's our first visual source from chapter 27. The machinery department of the Crystal Palace. So what overall impression of Britain's industrial technology was this engraving intended to convey? Right, so notice the building itself as well as the machinery. The scale, intricacy, and the complexity of the machinery and the sophistication of the manufacturing process on display here could indicate that British manufacturing technology was on the cutting edge of industry. And the setting really contributes to the sense of how this machinery shaped British life. The building was considered a marvel of its time and was built of steel and glass that was produced by British factories using similar machinery. And so as you look at the visitors, how are the visitors to this exhibit portrayed? And what segment of British society do you think they represent? Well, the visitors are portrayed as interested spectators, right? And they seem to be in family units, indicating that the outing was suitable for all genders and ages. And they're dressed in clothing that suggests maybe middle and upper class backgrounds. Don't really see any working class figures at this exhibit. So why did technological development become such a prominent measure of human achievement? Well, technologies, and especially those that harnessed new fossil fuel energy sources, were central to the growth in human productivity. And technological breakthroughs were prominent symbols of the broader industrializing process. And so technological development was driven by human ingenuity. Okay, visual source number 2, the railroad is a symbol of the industrial era. I love this image here. What attitude towards the railroad, in particular in the industrial age, in general, does this image suggest? It was a positive development that allowed for greater leisure and travel. That's possible when viewing the image. And the industrial age provided new opportunities for people and improved the quality of life for some. So look at the view out the window. What do the telegraph lines in St. Paul's Cathedral, a famous feature of the London landscape, contribute to the artist's message? Well, the telegraph lines remind the viewer of other advances facilitated by the Industrial Revolution that helped to improve communication. And St. Paul, from an artistic standpoint, provides a familiar background as you view this portion of the London landscape, skyline. From the perspective of the new industrial society, it reminds the viewer of how the new developments have cut into the heart of old cities. Right? Like, for example, this train crossing the Thames River that runs through the heart of London, and how the new technologies coexist with older accomplishments of pre-industrial England. So it's showing a nice mix. What marks this family as middle class? And how would you compare this image to the painting on page 838? Well, details that mark the family as middle class include their travel on a train in a luxury cabin as opposed to coach, and their dress, the father's ability to read, is represented by the newspaper, and the fact that they are returning maybe from a vacation or a leisure recreational activity. And this image and the one from page 838, both families display the trappings of the middle class of their clothing and the items in their possession. But it's unclear whether they derive from the same segments of middle class society. One family is returning from vacation while another is having tea or coffee in their home. Okay, visual source 3. Outside the factory. Scarecrow in the dinner hour. Okay, how do you respond to Crow's painting? Do you think it was an honest portrayal of factory life for women? Is there anything that might be missing? Well, the factory setting and the clothing and demeanor of the women indicate an honest portrayal of factory life. It's quite possible. You could also argue that the scene has an idyllic quality that may be misleading. Some happily socializing during one of the few moments of rest in a long day of labor. But that wasn't always the case, and they're in simple but clean attire, and that's highly unlikely on this brick-paved square that gives no indication of squalor or overcrowding that was actually pretty common in many urban neighborhoods. And so missing from the scene is, like I said, the squalor of urban life. None of the women display injuries from their work. And the scene depicts one of the few periods of rest in a day dominated by intense labor. So why do you think Crow set the scene outside the factory rather than within it? Well, the outside setting is more aesthetically pleasing, better light, more interesting background. And women interacting socially rather than in a work situation provide a more interesting subject. So it's possible that Crow wished to depict these women in a more human setting rather than on the factory floor. Do you see the small mill figure in the dark coat carrying a cane, perhaps the owner of the mill? If so, how would you imagine his relationship to the young women? Well, he saw these women as one commodity among many, right, that he needed to keep his factory operating. He may have viewed these women with paternal interest, since they were an important part of his operation and needed to care for him, and he may have viewed them with suspicion even, because periods of socializing among workers could provide an environment which they could organize, right, and come up with ideas. Okay, visual source 14, inside the factory, showing child labor, and this is from about 1912. So what impressions of factory life does Hines seek to convey in this photograph? Intense labor, crowded and dirty conditions, child labor, and those are the obvious ones. How do the women and children in this image compare with those from the previous image? Visual source 17.3. Well, here the women are depicted at work rather than at a leisure time or on break, and they're inside rather than outside. Those are the obvious answers. But did you notice their clothing is less substantial and they are less likely to have shoes? The supervision by the factory management is much clearer. And how would you imagine a conversation between Hein and Crow discussing these two images could have gone? Well, Hein was a social organizer and campaigner, and he would likely point out that Crow painted an image that romanticized the aspects and question the choice of a leisure setting rather than the factory work scene, which is much more real, and point out the lack of the urban squalor and slum. But Crow might question the aesthetic values of Hein's photo. Heinz and Crow might have agreed that the working class were worthy of depiction and that such depictions provide an opportunity to raise awareness among elites of the factory workers' lives. Alright, visual source by John Leach, Capital and Labor. How would you define that theme precisely? Capital and labor. Well, the leisure, wealth, and luxury of the rich are made possible, right, by the labor and suffering and deprivation of workers. Right? It almost looks like, is this a chain or the underground, which is really what it looks like. So how are the sharp class differences of industrial Britain represented in this visual source? Well, class differences are represented in the juxtaposition of well-dressed upper-class figures being waited on by servants, surrounded by luxurious furnishings and pets, and they're placed at the top of the panel and depicted in color. While the working poor, which includes children, and those stooped with age and old and injury, and workers engaged in what's probably mining labor in the background. And the working poor are placed at the bottom of the panel and depicted in shades of brown and gray. Right, and then you have the overseer to the left that's in color. So how does this connect the Industrial Revolution with Britain's colonial empire? And keep in mind about this figure in the upper right-hand corner reclining in exotic splendor, maybe in India. Now, the figure to the upper right of the panel seems to be a native colonial elite figure, represented by his servant, his dress, the exotic furnishings, a pet parrot. And to what extent does the image correspond with, say, Karl Marx's and Frederick Engels' description of industrial society? Well, this image possesses many features that correlate well with the passages from document 17.4, right, including the sharp contrast between privileged bourgeoisie and the exploited proletariat, the worker. And so the integration of the entire world into the bourgeoisie system is represented by the figure in the top right of the panel, right? As a native that's of elite status. And there's a sense of humans as mere labor commodities to be used up in the industrial toil. However, not all of the Marx selection is represented. There's no sign of the class struggle or revolution that was envisioned by both Marx and Engels, nor is there a sense of the great strides in productivity brought on by industrialization. And that is the end of Chapter 17, Reflections and Visual Sources.